Hi, I'm Steve Kep, co-founder of From Day One, our forum on corporate values. In today's webinar, we'll be exploring a very timely topic, which is about how to foster culture continuity during an extended crisis. Our sponsor today is Achievers, and we have two great presenters, Vanessa and Bree. I'll pass it over to Bree and give her a few seconds to get her slides set up.
Hello, and thank you so much for that intro, and thank you all for joining us today. Just to reiterate what was just said, although you have been muted upon entry, that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. Our goal for this discussion is for each of you to walk away with actionable insights and some clear practical steps you can employ within your organization. So if you have any questions or points of clarification, please drop them in the Q&A panel, because we are going to be taking a couple of micro pauses throughout the presentation to answer live questions. As just mentioned, my name is Bree Harvey. I spent the first decade of my career in talent acquisition and on the training and development side of the house. But in my current role as an employee engagement evangelist, I get to write and speak about the future of work and the story that the data tells about employee motivation and how organizations can build people-first, high-performing cultures. And I could not be any more thrilled to be joined today by one of my professional and personal inspirations, the Chief Customer Officer of Achievers, Vanessa Brangwyn. Vanessa, thank you so much for being born and for being here with us today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about you and your role?
Yes, Bree, you are so sweet. Thank you so much for having me. I've been at Achievers for almost 10 years. And I've served in a variety of roles in that decade. I currently have the opportunity to lead the most incredible team of customer success managers and leaders who are dedicated to developing employee engagement programs that ultimately contribute to strategic business objectives for our customers and serving our customers' employees all over the world, over 3 million people. When I'm not thinking about all things recognition and engagement, I'm usually chasing my 6-year-old all over the house and trying to avoid that painful moment that I know everyone who's on this call that's a parent can relate to, stepping on those tiny little pieces of Lego. I don't know why they hurt so much when they're so small, but they do.
That sounds really painful. Now, before we get into the agenda, I wanted to quickly contextualize where a lot of the research we'll be talking about today came from. The Workforce Institute is the research arm of Achievers, and they're basically a team of really talented, smart people scientists focused on studying how culture and employee engagement translate into business outcomes in the real world. They put out a lot of great white papers and reports, and today we'll be pulling some little nuggets from their latest publication, the Culture Report, which you can see in the Resources tab of your console. A quick overview of how we'll be spending our time together. We're going to start by defining the concept of culture continuity and chat about why it's relevant for HR in 2021. But really, we're going to spend a bulk of the time unpacking 3 actionable steps of how to get there. Then we're going to wrap it up with some key takeaways, open up the floor for more Q&A. And for anyone who has joined us late, please know that we will be taking questions throughout. So please don't be shy. Now, so since the onset of the pandemic, we've had the opportunity to sit down with hundreds of CEOs and CHROs about their response to COVID-19. And although there is a vast variance in how different organizations are being impacted, one thing that's happening across most sectors, minus those that are experiencing hypergrowth, is most organizations have slipped into austerity mode and are understandably having cost savings very much on the mind, trying to control fixed costs, such as salary or promotional increases, traditional rewards, and really a lot of total rewards offerings are being reevaluated. So the million or billion-dollar question, Vanessa, my little Yoda, is how can we continue to drive employee motivation and performance and retain our top talent when budgets are tight and perhaps employee disillusionment is already a little bit up because some of the benefits or rewards that were traditionally in place have been removed?
Yeah, Bree, this is such an important question. And I want to call out that it's not just on the minds of HR, but in fact, many executives are thinking about this on a regular basis. And what's interesting is it's not even really a new question. Organizations have increasingly been seeking to uncover the most effective and low-cost ways to energize and motivate their employees. They've been thinking about that for years. But another factor that we often talk about that makes this situation unique, in addition to some of the disillusionment, tough word, that has surfaced in the cases where benefits or pay or rewards are being removed, is people are feeling fatigued from organizational disruption. People are burnt out. Parents are burnt out. I read somewhere that people are in 60% more meetings. For me personally, this feels like 600%. But one thing that the research says that remains incredibly consistent is that if you take two people in the same job, one person who's getting 10% over market value in terms of their compensation, but doesn't really feel a part of the team, they don't feel challenged, they don't feel like the work they're doing is meaningful. And you look at the other person who's actually getting 10% less than market value, but they do truly feel part of the team. They feel appreciated and valued, and like they're being given a chance every day to try new things because the company's investing in them. The person who's overpaid compared to market is 100% more likely to not just leave, but underperform in the meantime while they're with the organization. So, it's interesting, but the best things in life continue to be free. And at the most fundamental level, for employees to be genuinely bought into your organization and give that discretionary effort, it's a requirement that they feel valued, seen, and heard. The organizations who thrive will be those who understand that this pandemic has actually been a gift in disguise. Studies from Mercer and Gartner and other firms show that so many organizations are taking a wait-and-see approach in terms of adjusting their people strategy. But I think it's important to call out that HR needs to accept the fact that they're going to be forced, we're all being forced to operate with a lot of uncertainty well into 2021. And now is the time to reimagine the employee experience and systemically think about how do we weatherproof our organizational cultures.
Yeah, I love that. And it's simple, but it's so true. Anyone who's taken like a Psych 101 class may recall this concept of the hierarchy of human needs. And after our basic needs are met, we're programmed as a species to immediately crave to be seen, acknowledged, and heard. And this crisis, I agree with you, Vanessa, this is HR's moment to think about how to optimize and scale that human connection within their organizations, which is what we're talking about today. Another quick thing I wanted to add is that although the events that have unfolded since the pandemic have felt like on many levels like a once-in-a-lifetime event, there's a great deal of research on crisis and change management that highlights how organizations have successfully prevailed through all kinds of massive disruptive events like natural disasters, terrorist attacks, and so on. Gallup did some particularly fascinating research on what distinguished companies that plundered versus those who prevailed during the last economic downturn. And unsurprisingly, the organizations who were able to effectively rally employees around their mission and values maintained higher levels of engagement, experienced strong customer advocacy, productivity, all that good stuff. The Workforce Institute has been doing a ton of analysis about this since COVID-19 shook up the working world. And one of their key findings, which is consistent with the Gallup research from '08, is that value alignment remains to be the #1 predictor of engagement. Sometimes when this fluffy topic of value alignment comes up, people ask, like, what's that even mean? What is value alignment and how do you even measure it? And these questions kind of bring us to the concept of culture continuity. So Vanessa, would love to have you describe what culture continuity is and how it's a little bit different from culture alignment.
Yes, absolutely. I love talking about these concepts and helping them become more real for HR leaders all over the world. So the Workforce Institute, as Bree mentioned earlier, we've done a tremendous amount of work, and we've defined culture continuity as the extent to which an organization maintains culture alignment during a critical event. So of course, that begs the question about what is culture alignment. And while culture alignment is the extent to which a company knows what its cultural values are and aligns everything it does to those values. Although at first glance, this may seem, again, somewhat high level and a fluffy concept, the good news is the roadmap to fostering culture continuity is actually pretty straightforward. And it entails doubling down or even just tweaking things you're likely already doing or things you already have on your radar. Each step goes back to this idea that for employees to be fully bought into your organization, they have to feel valued, seen, and heard. And we're going to spend the rest of our time together today breaking down these 3 simple steps to get there, starting with how to reinforce and amplify your values through regular employee recognition.
Yeah, and I'll just add before we get into this first point, I want to encourage you to pop any questions you have as we go through this into the Q&A panel, because before we move on, we're going to pause and answer a few of them because there's a lot to unpack here, starting with the fact that HR needs to come to terms with the reality that having your values plastered on your wall or printed in an employee manual that no one reads isn't enough to bring them to life or give them meaning. One of the only proven mechanisms that exists to bring your values to life and integrate them into the flow of work for employees in a meaningful way is through values-based peer-level recognition. Management doesn't have visibility on what's going on in the front lines. Even before COVID, when we were all in the same place, the best that they could see of the work that was being done on the front lines was 30%. When you empower frontline employees with the tools to call out the work that's being done around them as it relates to your mission and your values, when you continuously encourage them to acknowledge each other for demonstrating those guiding principles, the values become real and actually infused into the minds of employees and into the flow of work for employees. Beyond being the most scalable and proven effective way to align employees to key behaviors, recognition also has been proven to be one of the top drivers of engagement and have a direct impact on fostering connection and a sense of belonging with employees. So it makes sense that most organizations have some kind of recognition initiative or program in place. What's concerning, however, is that according to World at Work's Trends in Recognition report, only 18% of those companies claim that their investment is definitely working. This disconnect can be explained by the fact that although for the most part, recognition does have net positive effects, not all recognition is created equal. Research spanning from consulting houses to academia shows that for recognition to move the needle on engagement and actually have an impact on value alignment and culture continuity, it has to have a few particular characteristics. Having deployed hundreds of recognition programs with some of the world's largest, most complex organizations, we call these characteristics the 3 golden rules of employee recognition. Let's delve into each of these a little more closely, starting with the fact recognition has to be inclusive, meaning democratized and free-flowing from the bottom up, side to side, in all directions, not just top-down, unidirectionally. I can't overemphasize the fact that the people who are doing the work are the only ones really seeing the work, and it's absolutely vital for frontline workers to be enabled to call out when people around them are demonstrating the company's values. They have to be empowered to lift up the unsung heroes around them. Managers should do it, leaders should do it also, but it's necessary to enlist the help of employees to foster a culture of appreciation. The other component of inclusiveness has to do with making the moments visible to everyone, regardless of their location, function, or level. When recognitions are inclusive and transparent, it serves to amplify those positive moments, and it gives employees and leadership direct line of sight into all the wins happening across the business, so everyone can virtually celebrate in those wins together, which bolsters morale and helps remind employees that it's not all bad and the business is moving forward in the right direction.
I think, especially now when employees might be feeling isolated or stressed due to heavier workloads, there's been reductions in staff or, extra expectations put on employees, amplifying those positive moments can act as a really powerful buffer to that notion of employee burnout. I think that, if we keep moving through these golden rules that are so important, the second characteristic that we see for effective employee appreciation is really all about the specificity of the recognition. And the more specific a recognition is about why an exhibited behavior deserves to be recognized, the stronger that emotional impact will be on the receiver and their performance. If you were to say something like, "Thanks for being awesome," that would be very nice, but not really meaningful or convincing. And it doesn't lead to that improved employee performance. It's so important to be really explicit about how the behavior ties back to the organization's values and strategic goals, especially in these times of high stress where employees might be wondering, does my job even matter? What's my purpose here? It's just so incredibly critical to guide them to see the connection of how their daily contributions are actually having a real impact on the organization's mission and purpose.
Absolutely. And although some people might not be naturally inclined to be a recognition manager or a leader and express gratitude, being specific and using words in a way that really describes the impact of a behavior is something that can be learned and a gap that can be bridged by manager recognition training.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the pieces that so many of our customers that we partner with have adopted as part of their manager best practices, is really helping managers understand the how as well as the why around recognition. So before we jump into the final pillar, let's actually pause here and do a quick poll and ask our audience, how frequently are the employees within your organization being recognized? You'll see a little pop-up here in a second, and we would love to know, is the average employee receiving one recognition or less per year? Are people being recognized perhaps 2 to 4 times a year, 4 to 6 times a year, or even more than 6 times a year? Or maybe you're not sure. That's totally okay too. We talk to organizations every day who aren't measuring this in a way that they could actually answer this question.
Yeah, and I'll just clarify that when we ask about how frequently your employees are being recognized, we're not talking about kind of informal verbal praise. We're talking about either formal recognition, whether that takes the kind of manifests in a transparent peer-to-peer recognition, or any kind of nomination-based award, manager to employee recognition. And you don't have to be exact here. You can kind of guesstimate and give us a directional answer. So we'll give it 1 to 3 more seconds and check out our results.
Awesome, and great points, Bree. Thank you so much for clarifying. Okay, looking at these, wow, all right. So about a quarter of you average 1 recognition or less per year. Another 20% are in that 2 to 4 times per year bucket. 16% in the 4 to 6 times a year. And then 8% have pretty strong cultures of appreciation with 6 recognitions or more each year. That's wonderful. And that leaves the remaining group, so about 31%, not quite sure, maybe because they're not measuring it, or it may not be the area of the business that you're responsible for. You know, if we were to chart this on a graph, there would be a nice little downward slope, which I think is fitting considering the recognition deficit that we're seeing across the market.
Yeah, if we like plotted this, it would just be like, phew.
Exactly.
And I don't want to alarm anyone who indicated that you're either not measuring the regularity of recognition, or your employees aren't getting those higher levels of recognition. But the harsh reality that the data has consistently shown over the last 10 years is that recognition, sadly and simply, doesn't work unless it's frequent. Recognition doesn't help reinforce behaviors or improve engagement unless it's being received regularly. And in fact, nothing in life works unless it's regular. Training a dog, learning a new language, working on communication with your partner. You would never exercise 5 times a year and expect bodily transformation. Recognition and your employees is no different. All of the wonderful benefits of recognition that we just covered are sadly a lot shorter lived than most organizations and leaders previously assumed. Recognition is a short-term need that has to be satisfied on an ongoing basis.
Yes, such great points, Bree, and thanks for the reminder to up my exercise game as well. But, you know, the Workforce Institute has been analyzing this data for almost 20 years across hundreds of companies, and they've found that organizations that average at least 1 unique recognition received per employee per month experience the strongest measurable impacts to performance. So recognitions per employee should actually be measured monthly, not annually. We'll have to update our poll for the future. Now, if 1 recognition per employee per month sounds like a lot, you should all know that it's impossible to reach these optimal recognition levels without decoupling rewards from recognition. The goal is to ensure that they're seen in the eyes of your employees as being separate. And motivating employees through pushing incentives or pushing rewards actually has a relatively weak exchange rate with today's knowledge worker, and tends to create a culture of entitlement where employees become expectant of that reward component.
Yeah, there's a lot of studies that kind of talk about the poor exchange rate of pushing rewards, but we know from our own experience in the field that when we in the past have designed recognition programs that weigh too heavily on rewards, it does result in cynicism and animosity between employees and can create this "what have you done for me lately" culture. So if the end goal is to align employees to core values in a meaningful way and have a sustaining impact on culture continuity and engagement and performance, recognition strategy has to be centered around frequent, non-monetary, peer-to-peer recognition. And even without looking at the neuroscience of how powerful social recognition is on performance, and it is powerful, it's kind of common sense that if Vanessa recognizes me in a way that's authentic and my peers see it, I'm going to be energized and motivated to repeat that behavior, which is why the Workforce Institute recommends over half of all recognitions flowing through a particular organization to be free of reward.
Yeah, and if I could just add, something for everyone here, this isn't something that typically happens for most of our customers immediately after they implement a recognition solution. It's so important to understand the from to, for where an organization's culture might be at. So depending on how reward-centric the organization might be in terms of a baseline, it could take up to a year to get to that benchmark. But across all recognitions that flow through our customer base, about 63% of them are actually non-monetary.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that. Like, for anyone that's listening, that is like, what is this snake oil? It's definitely a crawl, walk, run journey, and it's necessary to meet organizations where they're at. Now, let's talk real quickly about how these 3 golden rules play out in the real world. So the Workforce Institute did a really interesting, simple cross comparison of 2 different recognition programs. Each company had around 70,000 employees. Both recognition programs were launched about 3 years ago. The big thing that doesn't make this a perfect apples to apples comparison, quick disclosure, is that company A is a large grocery retailer, while company B is a pharmaceutical company. And this is relevant because retail has an employee base of what we would call offline, meaning they're not in front of a computer all day, while company B has online employees that have more access to smartphones and devices throughout the day. We know from our benchmark data that the combination of kind of being in a higher turnover business like retail, along with offline employees, it does tend to result in somewhat lower program usage out the gate. So we know that this comparison, company A is at a bit of a handicap. However, when we look at how the programs actually performed, what we found was a little surprising.
Yeah, when I first saw the data about these programs, 2 things jumped out at me. The first was that both organizations embraced those first 2 golden rules that we talked about to varying degrees around inclusivity and specificity. But the most notable difference was actually evident when I looked at the deployment of that 3rd pillar around effective recognition, fostering a culture where employees get recognized frequently with less of the emphasis on the reward component. Company A really centered their strategy on driving those frequent, non-monetary peer recognitions that Bree, you were speaking about. And they did it so much, actually, that they didn't even introduce rewards into their program for the first year. So today, 63% of all recognitions that flow through Company A's program are in that non-monetary bucket, where Company B adopted a more traditional approach focusing on rewards. They actually average 36% peer-to-peer recognitions, which include both the monetary and the non-monetary. So this difference in the philosophy of valuing that regular meaningful recognitions versus valuing the rewards can really be seen most clearly in the fact that the average employee at Company A receives around 7 recognitions per month, while the average employee at Company B receives less than a third of 1 recognition each month, so about 4 recognitions a year. So Company A, despite being at a bit of a disadvantage due to some of the factors Bree mentioned, high turnover and the offline nature of the business, they actually experienced literally 10 times more recognition moment over this 3-year period of research.
Yeah, and I love this comparison because it's so simple and it tells the story that it doesn't matter if you have a high turnover business with a lot of field employees that are offline. Fostering a culture of regular, frequent recognition is totally attainable for everyone. So in summary, to achieve culture continuity and truly embed your values into the flow of work for employees, recognition's got to be inclusive, specific, and most importantly, frequent. If you're averaging less than one recognition per employee per month, there's probably some opportunity to adopt a strategy that's less rewards centric and get more bang for your buck by leveraging the power of non-monetary recognition.
Yeah, and you know what, Bree, before we move on to the second step to talk about achieving culture continuity, I'd love to invite everyone to just pause for a moment. You can even close your eyes if you'd like, and just reflect on which of these 3 golden rules your organization maybe struggles with the most and what impact it could have if you were able to close that gap. And while you're thinking about that, let's just take a quick peek over here at questions in the Q&A panel. Gonna read through some of these while you guys are reflecting. Oh, here's a really good one. All right, have you found that millennials require more recognition or want to give more feedback than other age demographics? Great question.
Okay, I love this question, and I'll answer this one first because as a millennial, this is a myth I love debunking. So over the years, we've done a lot of analytics looking at how different age demographics use our platform. And one thing that surprises a lot of baby boomers and Gen Xers is that the differences aren't that great. Gen Zers and millennials do show a slightly stronger propensity to openly express wanting more frequent feedback and recognition, but studies show that there are a lot more similarities than nuances, and that's consistent with what we see when we look at the usage of our own recognition platform. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it, because going back to, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's like these are intrinsic, universal needs that transcend culture and age demographic. People are wired to need to feel seen and heard and valued. And it's true within our working environments.
Yeah, I think one thing I'll just add, if I could, is that even since the pandemic, the Workforce Institute has been looking into whether or not any generational variations in employee responses with intent to leave and versus recognitions received, the correlation there. And while I don't have the exact percentages off the top of my head, the headline from the research is that there wasn't a statistically significant difference there. So, to Bree's point, there may be some slight differences, but I don't think they're as great as any of us, might assume or might question. So, great question.
I love that.
Again.
Yeah, thank you so much for your questions. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and start to unpack the second step of strengthening culture continuity. And it has to do with upgrading your approach to employee listening. So here's the thing. At this point in the pandemic, at this point in the working world, it's been established that when workplace anxiety is heightened and there's more disruptions at work and at home, it's even more important for employees to feel regularly heard. And it's long been known that organizations with well-executed approaches to employee listening have shown to consistently outperform their peers. Now, Vanessa, I know this is something that you've written and spoken about a lot from the HR tech perspective, as well as your experience as a leader. And I would love for you to kind of take us through what considerations employers should take into account to ensure their approach is optimized for this post-COVID workplace. With regards to their employee listening strategy, because we all know it's becoming increasingly fast-paced and digital. Would love for you to kind of break down some of those key considerations.
Yeah, absolutely. So many things have been accelerated, and I empathize with the HR leaders I speak to on a daily basis with the pace that everyone is moving at. So, the first consideration that I often encourage HR to think about when ensuring the listening strategy is appropriate for this new post or current pandemic era workplace we're all living in is that it really needs to be multi-channeled. One of the most talked about topics since the pandemic is the importance of regular manager one-to-ones. And it would be difficult to overstate just how vital those are. However, the research shows that relying solely on managers or on any one particular channel just isn't enough. The Workforce Institute released a 2020 culture report not that long ago that exposed that 77% of employees would be more honest in a survey than they would be in a conversation with their manager. And, this isn't to say that managers shouldn't be encouraged to check in with their employees or that those one-on-ones aren't vital. We know they are. We know they need to continue, but they need to be supplemented. And in this digital world, they need to be supplemented with technology so that the organization can get full visibility into the macro level trends taking place across the company, across various departments and locations, especially as remote work will continue to be normalized. We as leaders need to adapt to the fact that we live in a world full of people who feel more inclined to express their truth behind the comfort of a screen than in person. This digital culture breeds lots of paper tigers, and it's really our job to try and react to that.
Yeah, it's easy to be like, people just need to be more upfront, but you're exactly right. It's our job to react to the trends that's happening collectively in the marketplace. And when thinking about how to do what you're describing and how to best supplement employee feedback gathered from manager one-on-ones or even feedback that you're gathering from skip level meetings or town halls, I think it's helpful to take a step back and understand the variances between the three categories of employee engagement measurement. We're all familiar, obviously, with the traditional annual engagement surveys, but around 2013, the market started seeing more frequent quarterly pulse surveys. And a little more recently, we saw the emergence of these more always on continuous listening and sentiment analysis tools that can kind of manifest as weekly or even daily engagement trackers. And what makes this category unlike the other two is the goal is to ensure the leaders or the managers are being alerted to trends, employee concerns in between surveys, kind of in real time, more like a canary in the coal mine, so to speak. And most organizational development experts, including our own in-house chief workforce scientist, Dr. Natalie Baumgartner, agree that the best practice is to deploy 2 or more of these.
Yeah, and one thing I'll just mention quickly here is that just hopefully make everyone feel a little bit better is that there's not one silver bullet that's going to work in every company. We have customers across, regions and industries, verticals who do all 3. We have some who just do annual surveys and use our always on listening tool to gauge and react to how they're doing in between those surveys. So there's some options here, and it kind of comes back to what we were saying earlier about recognition and going from where the culture is today with thinking of that with the from to perspective, and also the comments that Bree made about crawling before you're walking, before you're running. The point is, in this new pandemic era world, we need to be complementing manager one-on-ones with some type of employee listening technology, so you can give your people the freedom and the space to be candid with their observations, and you can be more agile and informed with how you're prioritizing your people strategy. So this, as we think about the second consideration, I want to encourage you all to think about how to optimize this listening strategy, and that comes down to how often you're surveying. Yet again, we're talking about frequency, and honestly, at this point, it's really hard to argue against the fact that nothing annual works. This is true, as we saw with recognition. We've known it for years with performance management, and checking in with how your employees are feeling is really no different.
Yeah, and again, this isn't exactly new news. The market
Right.
has known for a long time that relying just on annual surveys alone isn't enough due to how quickly things move in the world of business. The last 5 to 7 years alone, you can see here on this graph that the percentage of companies who've shed their annual engagement survey and replaced it or augmented it with something more frequent has skyrocketed. The Workforce Institute has spent a lot of time during the pandemic analyzing engagement trends and found that those who kind of took the plunge and adopted a more agile approach to employee listening and were checking in more than 4 times a year had employee populations that were 41% more engaged.
Yeah, this is actually why we've been doubling down, especially recently, on our recommendations to customers for the ones we've been making for years, which is to conduct pulse surveys throughout the year, ideally 3 to 4 times throughout the year. And those don't have to be those big 80 question surveys. These are mini surveys to check in on how things are going, as well as the idea of using an always-on tool for all those in-between moments, and really giving HR and empowering leaders with that real-time visibility on trends and feedback in between the surveys. One of the huge benefits, in fact, of taking this more agile approach is that it empowers HR to navigate change management from new policies or various culture initiatives with actual data, data at their fingertips. And that allows all of you to be more proactive instead of reactive. And I think we can all agree that that's something we all strive for.
Yeah, sometimes easier said than done, proactive instead of reactive.
Totally.
One thing that we should probably clarify is kind of going back to the Workforce Institute's findings about the association between more frequent polling and higher engagement levels. Is we're not suggesting that surveying your employees more frequently causes an increase of engagement, but rather we would postulate that the data suggests that when organizations have put in the work to implement a more continuous listening strategy, and they have kind of built out effective feedback loops and empowered and trained managers to respond to employee feedback, so the burden isn't just on HR. There's just an association there, not necessarily a causation.
Yes, such an important point to clarify. Thank you so much for doing that, Bree, because this actually gets into the third consideration and arguably the most important one, which is that listening is ultimately only half the battle. You can collect the feedback, but as Bree said, just asking the question doesn't create further engagement. The listening part of listening, or the most important part of listening, actually requires action. And I'm so curious about what you all have to say about this. So we're going to do a quick poll to get a sense from our audience today. How are your managers doing with regards to responding and acting on employee feedback?
Yeah, and this is a hot topic. Lots of people have strong and sometimes differing opinions. So I can't wait to get your take on this. You should see a poll popping up on your screen, but we want to know, would you say that your managers are responding to feedback, A, pretty good, all things considered, or B, okay, maybe some are good, maybe some aren't so good, but you have some kind of process or expectation in place? Or would you say there's plenty of room for improvement, a little RFI, room for improvement? Or maybe you're not sure because you don't track that, or maybe it's not your area of the business. Or E, perhaps it's not even part of your manager's scope of their job, and it's not currently part of their duties. We speak to no shortages of companies who kind of take that stance that managers can't handle the truth, can't handle the feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. There's quite the range here, and we've given you some big options to consider. So let's give it another second or two, and then I'll take a look at the results. All right. Okay. So, looks like there's 6% of you who can pretty much ignore everything else we're about to say in the next section because your managers are stepping up to the challenge and pretty well enabled to handle the feedback. So that's great. Another 12% have indicated that managers are doing okay with responding to employee feedback. So that's definitely something. 39%, a good chunk, the biggest chunk in fact, feel like they could use some improvements. 23% not sure, maybe not measuring it. And the final 20%, not yet the responsibility of managers to act on the feedback. So, what you've shared isn't hugely surprising. I think this is in line with what I was expecting. And, for anyone who answered from C down, which is the biggest chunk, please don't feel bad. One of the biggest challenges organizations are facing is trying to figure out how to empower managers to respond appropriately to employee feedback. So you are definitely not alone if you answered in that section.
Yes, absolutely. And although I totally acknowledge that the thought of starting the journey to get managers to take ownership over the engagement of their teams and be accountable for kind of coming up and following through with action plans, it's very daunting. But HR leaders need to acknowledge also that the research shows there's no such thing as survey fatigue, but inaction fatigue is real, and too many employees are suffering from it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an important point. It bears repeating. Survey fatigue does not exist, but inaction fatigue definitely does. And if your tools and processes aren't fundamentally centered around empowering leaders and managers to systematically react to what employees are sharing, you've lost the battle before your survey even goes out.
Absolutely. And one analogy I've heard that I think is a great demonstration of this point is, imagine your house is on fire and I approach you and I'm like, hey, I have this product that will tell you all kinds of information about this fire, what parts of the house are really burning, which areas are less affected, where the fire started. You would tell me to get out of your face and give you a fire extinguisher. Understanding the characteristics of how engaged your employees are doesn't help you or your managers figure out what to do to address it. And Achievers as an organization learned this firsthand back in 2012, about a year after we released our first employee listening product. And we were conducting focus groups with customers to figure out what they liked and where they wanted improvements. And although most of them felt it was great to have real-time visibility into what was happening on the front lines, they had managers and leaders who were struggling to figure out what to do with the feedback. Like, it's unreasonable to expect all your managers to intuitively know how to reply to feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because, at the end of the day, managers and leaders are employees too. And so we need to remember that. After the time Bree was sharing, our Workforce Institute embarked on a journey that over a few years, in fact, to build out and iterate on our products that was firmly rooted in the latest academic research and centered around closing that gap, around guiding managers to translate the data into simple micro actions that could solve for some of the unique engagement issues of their employees. And one of the biggest misconceptions about acting on feedback is that it has to be this big, complex, formal process. But most of the time, the micro actions, the tiny movements, things that involve making just small tweaks to policies or guidelines, or making sure your employees know that you hear their concerns and you're working towards a solution, those are the things that actually have the largest impact, which is great because they're more manageable too.
Yeah, exactly. And we know that when leaders and managers have simple, easy to use tools that allow for them to take ownership of building team culture centered around frequent feedback that gets acted on, it can be absolutely transformative for engagement and culture continuity.
Yes, exactly. And in summary, this second section, if you're evaluating your employee listening strategy to make sure it's appropriate for the times we're all living in, which I think and I hope everyone is doing, and because you care about creating these amazing work experiences for your employees to show up and genuinely feel seen and heard and appreciated, my best advice is to ensure you're complementing and staying focused on those manager one-on-ones and town halls and communication, but complement those things with some combination of continuous listening tools. The golden standard would be to aim for at least checking in 3 times a year while having that always on tool to capture the feedback and sentiment in between. And for sure, making action a huge part of your listening strategy.
Yes, and again, not to beat a dead horse, but if you're doing it right, oftentimes the micro actions will be as simple as communicating that you've heard people's concerns and you're working on a solution. It doesn't always have to be this massive, complicated rollout plan to address what's going on. So I think that we have some time for questions, but before we do, to wrap it up, wanted to kind of just summarize that today we talked a lot about stuff, but we started by defining what culture continuity is, and we talked about why it's so important, aka it's the single most predictable and controllable factor that HR has within your sphere of influence to impact business success through disruption. We explored how culture continuity is rooted in the idea that for employees to be fully bought into your organization, they have to feel at a fundamental level like they're seen, heard, and valued. We talked about the blueprint of how to get there, which involves 3 simple steps, which are to reinforce and amplify your values through regular employee recognition that abides by the 3 golden rules, elevate your employee listening strategy so it's appropriate for the pandemic era workplace, and of course, by empowering your managers and leaders to act on feedback. Before we open it up to the Q&A, I think we have some good questions in the panel. I just want to reiterate that our goal, the only reason why we're here today, our main goal is to provide hyper-relevant, actionable insights that are valuable to you. So I would absolutely love to receive the gift of your feedback. Please feel free to add me on LinkedIn, drop me a line, let me know what you thought of today, and most importantly, what we could do to make this as helpful as possible to you. I reply to 100% of my messages. They always make my day. Now how cute is this little pug? Let's get into some questions. And I hope you're not feeling like this guy, because we are excited to hear your thoughts. Okay. Vanessa, I think this first one has your name written all over it. What advice would you give an HR leader who belongs to an organization that has a leadership team that doesn't understand the importance of regular appreciation?
Oh, yes. I'm so glad somebody asked this question, actually, because, Bree, in preparing for this discussion, you and I were actually considering whether we should address this question proactively, because in my experience, I would say about 1/3 of companies fall into the category of having values, but not really having much in place to reinforce them. In fact, PwC has a really great report called The Guide to Culture, and that addresses this topic in quite a lot of detail. But to answer this question, I would reiterate the fact that a huge reason HR exists as a function is to be that steward to company culture and to really represent the voice of the employees. And if an organization's executive team is struggling or doesn't understand how living your values and regularly expressing gratitude translates into the bottom line, that can be the burden, or maybe phrased differently, the exciting challenge for HR to step up and really make that connection for them. There's a mountain of evidence that exists to build this business case, to garner the support needed, the resources to build out an engagement strategy. But it does require HR to be or to take, I should say, decisive, calculated action and help spell it out for them in a way that will resonate. Achievers has an entire department focused on supporting our prospective customers on building these custom business cases. And most engagement vendors have something similar, or at least materials that can help guide your CEO and your executive team to the business benefits of this investment, especially taking into account where you're coming from today and making sure you're getting the biggest bang for your buck, or optimizing the investments that you have and stretching the dollar as far as it can go. And I know the thought of putting yourself out there can be scary, and asking for budget, those can be difficult conversations. But it's so much easier to forward an article, or, get to the point where you're really not doing a disservice to your employees by staying silent. So please connect with us if you're interested in more information specific to your organization.
Yeah, and like worst case scenario, you speak up about the urgent needs of your organization, and the powers that be say no, or not right now. Then you're in the same place that you're at now. I love that question. Exactly. Now the next one we're gonna pick. It's a really common one that I love about what are some ways we can encourage our managers to give non-cash recognition. And I'll kick this one off because I think it's a good opportunity to reemphasize the point that recognition shouldn't just fall on the shoulders of managers. Recognition, again, should be democratized, and really your recognition strategy should be peer-led, especially now when managers are spread so thin and everyone's working remote. So that's not to say that managers shouldn't be recognizing for good work, but at baseline, I think that it's positive to try and encourage managers to habitually set aside 5 minutes for shout outs on team meetings, or even like send snail mail with stamps and cards with handwritten thank you notes, and ensure that there is dedicated time, mostly on team meetings, that recognitions are circulating, that's free and powerful because, again, it's public. But there's a big difference between how managers send recognition and peers. Like when my manager sends me recognition, it feels good, but there's this expectation there sometimes of reward. There's a previous relationship and an underlying context, whereas when you focus your approach on getting peer level recognition, there's no ulterior motive. Like when a peer recognizes me, it's just an authentic display of gratitude. So encourage your managers to give non-cash recognition, but the question really should be, how can we encourage the frontline employees to be sending as much recognition, non-monetary, authentic recognition as possible?
Yeah, I think the peer-to-peer piece is so important, and that's also a great way to drive up that frequency, because it can't all fall on the shoulders of leaders and managers and executives. So really, to foster that true culture of recognition requires everyone to be participating in it. I think though managers do play an important role, and Bree, you touched so much on this. Just to add that, managers, the best managers are also great coaches. And how do we make sure that having those regular, meaningful conversations with their people is really important, and taking it beyond recognition into career development and in coaching and goal setting, all of those great things. In fact, one of our customers recently rolled out this really interesting program where employees are allowed to take up to 90 minutes a week of company time to take a class or read a book or do something that's going to make a better version of themselves. And that's a really effective and simple method to show your employees how much you care about their development and also their well-being as people. And then you can, of course, supplement that with managers recognizing them when they come back with the great insights and things that they've learned. So that might be a cool thing that some of our audience may want to try.
I love that, the 90-minute rule. Can we implement that, Vanessa, here?
Yeah, I know you and I both love that since we're such avid readers. So.
I love it. Okay, that is our time. I want to thank you all so much for joining us today and all your wonderful questions and participation. Vanessa, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be here with us. And we're going to turn it back over to our friend Steve.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. And a huge thank you to you, Bree. It was an honor and pleasure to be here today. Thank you.
Hi, this is Steve Kepp again at From Day One, the host of today's webinar. To wrap up, I'd like to thank our speakers, Vanessa and Bree, as well as our sponsor, Achievers. And thank you to all of our audience members for participating in this webinar. We look forward to bringing lots more engaging webinars and virtual conferences to you throughout the year. If you'd like to join us for more digital events, you can head to our website, fromday1.co, and see the schedule for the coming months. One in particular I'd like to mention is on Wednesday, January 20th, we'll be doing our first full-scale virtual conference of the new year with panel discussions, workshops, and networking. The focus is on acquiring skilled talent in 2021. How has the market changed? Visit our website at fromday1.co to learn more. Thank you, season's greetings, and stay safe.